How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to 2A News Now. And as always, I appreciate everybody that takes time out of their busy schedule to watch my videos, as well as those who support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing, and hitting those post notifications. I really do appreciate it. I have what some people would call an unbelievable, crazy ATF story. But since it's about the ATF, it's not that unbelievable. The ATF should be going after criminals, but not going after law-abiding citizens and law-abiding FFLs. I'm going to tell you the story about David Schifferel. I hope I pronounced his last name correctly. And he was a federal air marshal for 20 years. He also owned 5 acres of land that had his home on it. And he also had an organic farm. But his life and his family's life changed in December of 2020 when he was on his day off. He was called into the Federal Air Marshal's office to be interrogated. And while he was being interrogated, there were dozens and dozens of federal agents that were waiting outside of his property to get the okay to go in and raid his property. He said there were agents in cars and also on ATVs, and they even had a helicopter. And since he was called into the office to be interrogated, the only people that were there was his wife and 4 kids. And they asked him when he was being interrogated, had he ever bought a silencer? And he told them straight out no. And when they continued to ask him questions, he told them he wanted to talk to a lawyer first. And he was allowed to call his wife, and she told him the agents were already there. And they say this was all part of a global operation called Operation Silent Night. And they ended up seizing over 40,000 Chinese silencers, close to 5,000 weapons, and charged more than 200 people with crimes, including this guy, David. And this is all coming to light because this guy, David, recently did an interview with the Second Amendment Foundation. And he said the ATF is really screwing over law-abiding Americans. And he said the ATF screwed him over. And he also said that Homeland Security investigations and the ATF did him wrong. And that every ATF person involved in his case seemed evil. And he wanted to make it clear that he has never purchased a silencer in his life. But the ATF thought otherwise, because he had spent hundreds of dollars on a Chinese website. And the investigators said that website offered silencers for sale, as well as what they call possible silencers. But of course they sold tons of other things. And David said the site had incredible low prices. He said he bought an air compressor and filters and what he called filter media for them. He also said the prices were lower than Amazon prices, and that he needed a lot of gear, including the gear he purchased on that site, to operate his organic farm. He said he needed the filters for fuel, water, and other things. And he also had tanks full of water and fuel. And then a lot of his fuel and water systems were homemade. He said he saw on the website what he called a new type of tube. And he bought a lot of them for future farm projects. And he wanted to use them to filter solvents or fuel. And he said he bought dozens of them for that reason. He even bought a carbon fiber air tank, as well as some laser pointers when David was still at the office. They said a search warrant was already taking place at his house and his property. But they didn't tell him really what it was all about or how many people were involved in this raid of his house. But when he arrived at his home, he said most of the exterior doors were broken, and that his wife and 4 children were escorted out of the house before the federal agents trashed it. He said, and I quote, "They knew I wasn't there, but the government likes to overdo it so they can justify you looking dangerous later in the trial." And by the way, guess how many agents raided his home and property? And this is from Homeland Security Investigations and the ATF. 24. And they even threatened to break open his gun safes. But since he knew he had done nothing wrong, he opened them for them. And of course, he really didn't want to have to replace those gun safes, as well as having to replace the doors and windows of his home. And after 24 federal agents pretty much destroyed his home and spent hours and hours there, what did they take? One tube that was in a box that he had never opened. And in March of 2021, David was indicted. They charged him with illegal importation of a firearm and illegal possession of a firearm for a tube, like I said, that he hadn't even opened. And if he was convicted of those charges, the maximum he was facing was 20 years in prison and up to $750,000 in fines. And David claimed that's because he owned his house. Once he was indicted, he was stripped of his security clearance, so he had to retire being an air marshal. he had to pay $25,000 out of his pocket for an attorney, and then another $25,000 if the case went to trial. And if any expert witnesses were called, it would cost at least $30,000 for each. He had his attorney file different motions that the tube that he had purchased, also some call an inline filter, had been sold on that website for over 10 years. He said the government had 5 lawyers that wouldn't address any of their issues when they brought them up. And whenever they brought up the inline filter was not a suppressor, they would never address it. He also said he didn't think that they would ever go to trial and that they would drop the case because there really wasn't any evidence. But his attorney kept insisting that he take a deal from the state, and part of that deal would require him to take a gun course and enter mitigation. But he said they had already destroyed his career. And he said for months he talked about and thought about taking the deal, but he thought he would never be found guilty. And he needed to show what Homeland Security investigations and the ATF did to him. His attorney made him sign a letter that they were going forward with the case against his attorney's judgment. And here's another reason why he was convicted. He owned a lot of guns that were legal, and they had taken pictures of dozens and dozens of guns that the agents had put on his bed. He even said some of them were air rifles. And he believes that half of the jury convicted him because he had a lot of guns, and that they kept the picture up on the screen for hours until the guns told everybody in the court that the guns were legal and that they had to take down the picture. But of course, since it was up for hours, that was already in the jury's mind. And then he said he had bad feelings about his attorney. He said if he asked his attorney to do something, he would do just the opposite. And that's when he decided he was going to represent himself. And in court, when the state called the tube a silencer, his attorney didn't even object. David didn't testify in the trial at all. And when he was an air marshal for 20 years, he flew over 6 million miles with weapons on him at all times. And then the judge announced that the jury found him guilty of all counts. He was sentenced to 8 months in federal prison, as well as 10 months of home confinement. And during the home confinement, he also had to wear an ankle monitor. And then after that, 3 years of probation. He said he feels betrayed by his government. And when he appealed, he lost the appeal. And when he tried to petition to the U.S. Supreme Court, it was turned down. He said his lawyer was an ineffective counselor, and David wanted to push his case as a Second Amendment issue. But he was told he was being arrogant and wouldn't let him show in court his previous purchases on the website. And now that he's been out, him and his family run Redland Farms, and that he bought the tubes and other things because he knew he would need them for different uses on the farm, and that they could be used to filter water or oil. And what he thinks happened in the trial, the ATF reluctantly admitted the tubes were legal, and he believes the Department of Justice was allowed to convince a clueless jury that he intended to use or convert the tubes into illegal silencers. And during his defense, he said he was not allowed to present any evidence, and he wasn't allowed to bring his expert witness to testify in his defense. He said he never did anything illegal, and he never took one step or thought to convert anything into a silencer. Basically, the ATF and Homeland Security investigation falsely accused and convicted David of a crime he didn't commit. They railroaded him, and those lawyers preyed on a clueless jury to get him convicted, to justify their jobs, and in turn destroyed a man and his family who has to now pick himself up by the bootstraps and start all over again. It's absolutely sickening what they did to him. But of course, this is par for the course for the ATF and the Department of Justice. They love to prey on law-abiding citizens, but it seems like they're too scared to go after violent criminals. As always, I would really like to hear your thoughts about today's video in the comment section. And if you enjoy videos like this, and you also want to help the channel out and help it to continue to grow, I just ask you to take a few seconds of your time to like, share, and subscribe, and hit those post notifications. I would be very grateful if you did so. And I invite all of you to come back and watch my next video.